Sena Ravensky never planned to buy 3 white children at a frontier auction, especially not with burlap sacks tied over their heads like livestock being sold for slaughter. But when the youngest boy whispered her Apache name through the rough fabric, a name no white child should have known, she knew the spirits had brought her to Copper Mesa for a reason far greater than trading beadwork for winter supplies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Mesa as Sena guided her painted mare through the growing crowd of settlers, traders, and drifters who had gathered for the monthly auction. The year was 1887, and tensions between the Apache tribes and the expanding white settlements ran as hot as the Arizona desert wind. Sena, a woman of 32 winters with coal-black hair braided with silver threads and eyes the color of storm clouds, had made this journey from the sacred lands of her people to the frontier trading post only because her winter stores were dangerously low.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Her husband, a respected Apache warrior named Thunder Eagle, had fallen to cavalry bullets 3 seasons past, leaving her alone in a world that seemed to grow more hostile with each passing moon. She had not come to Copper Mesa to purchase human flesh, yet there she sat astride her horse, staring at a sight that made her stomach turn like rancid meat. 3 small figures stood on the auction platform, their hands bound behind their backs with rough hemp rope, coarse burlap sacks pulled down over their heads and tied at their necks like grain sacks ready for transport. The auctioneer, a greasy man with tobacco-stained teeth and suspenders that barely contained his bloated belly, called out to the growing crowd with the enthusiasm of a snake oil salesman hawking his latest cure. Orphans for sale, folks. 3 able-bodied boys, no families to claim them, no mouths you didn't bargain for feeding. Perfect for field work, barn chores, or whatever labor needs doing around your homestead. His voice carried across the dusty plaza like the caw of a carrion bird. Starting bid is $5 each, but I'll take 15 for the whole lot if you want to save yourself some coin. The crowd murmured with interest, some stepping closer to examine the merchandise as if they were inspecting livestock at a cattle auction. Sena's hands tightened on her reins until her knuckles showed white beneath her sun-darkened skin. In her 20 years of traveling to white settlements for trade, she had witnessed many horrors that made her question the hearts of these pale-skinned people. But this spectacle struck her with a revulsion so deep it felt like swallowing live coals. These were children, human beings with souls and dreams and fears, being sold like horses or pigs to whoever had the most coin in their pockets. The tallest of the 3 boys swayed on his feet, his thin frame suggesting he had not eaten a proper meal in many days. The middle child stood rigid as a fence post, his small fists clenched behind his back with what appeared to be barely controlled rage. But it was the smallest figure that drew Sena's attention like iron filings to a lodestone. The little one could not have seen more than 7 or 8 summers, and his small body trembled with what might have been cold, fear, or exhaustion. Who'll start the bidding at $5? The auctioneer bellowed, his voice cutting through the morning air like a rusty blade. These boys have been living rough, but they're strong enough for good honest work. The oldest one there has already shown he can handle a plow, and the little one follows orders without a peep of complaint. Several hands in the crowd began to rise, and Sena felt something dark and primal stir in her chest as she watched grown men prepare to purchase. Children like they were buying seed corn or fence posts. A weathered rancher in a black hat raised his hand first. $5 for the big one, he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I need someone to work my south pasture, and he looks like he's got some size on him already. The auctioneer nodded enthusiastically, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of profit as more hands began to appear in the crowd like vultures circling a fresh carcass. $7 for the middle boy, shouted a woman in a faded calico dress, her face hard as granite and her eyes calculating. My husband could use help in the mines, and this one looks like he's got fight in him. Fighters work harder when you break them proper. The casual cruelty in her voice made Senna's blood run cold as mountain snow, and she found herself urging her horse closer to the platform without conscious thought. That was when she heard it cutting through the noise of the crowd like an arrow through morning mist. A small voice, muffled by the burlap sack, but clear enough to stop her heart in her chest. Senna Ravensky. The words were whispered in perfect Apache pronunciation, each syllable pronounced with the reverence her people reserved for speaking the names of the honored dead. Every muscle in Senna's body went rigid as if she had been struck by lightning. No white child should know her name, let alone speak it in the sacred tongue of her ancestors. She had been careful to use only her English name Sarah Crow when trading in the white settlements, keeping her true Apache identity hidden like a blade beneath a blanket. Yet this small boy, bound and hooded like a captive animal, had spoken her real name with the accuracy of someone who had been taught by Apache tongues. The auctioneer continued his vile commerce, oblivious to the miracle that had just occurred. What am I bid for the little one? He's young enough to train proper, old enough to be useful. Makes no trouble, follows orders, quiet as a church mouse. The man grabbed the smallest boy's shoulder and turned him toward the crowd like a piece of pottery, being displayed for potential buyers. Perfect for household chores or watching younger children. Senna's mind raced like wildfire through dry grass as she tried to understand what had just happened. In Apache tradition, names held power, and to speak someone's true name was to acknowledge a connection deeper than blood or tribe. Her husband Thunder Eagle had given her the name Senna when they married, and only her closest family members knew it. The only white people who had ever heard it spoken were the few missionaries who had tried to convert her people, and they had all been driven from Apache lands years ago. She studied the three small figures on the platform with new eyes, searching for any clue that might explain this impossible moment. The boys wore the ragged clothing of orphans, their pants patched and repatched, their shirts more holes than fabric. Their bare feet were caked with dust and showed the calluses of children who had walked far longer than they should have needed to. Nothing about their appearance suggested any connection to her people, yet the youngest had spoken her name with the reverence of a prayer. $15 for all three. Called out a man with cold eyes and hands that bore the scars of someone who settled disagreements with his fists. I run a work camp up in the mountains, and I can always use more hands. They'll earn back their cost in a month of good labor. The auctioneer's face lit up like a man who had struck gold, and he raised his gavel to close the deal that would condemn 3 innocent children to a life of brutal servitude. Something deep in Senna's spirit, something that connected her to the wisdom of her grandmothers and the strength of the earth itself, compelled her to action. She dismounted from her painted mare with the fluid grace of someone who had been born in the saddle, her moccasined feet hitting the dusty ground without a sound. The leather pouch at her waist held the money she had brought to buy winter supplies. Enough silver coins to see her through the harsh months ahead. But as she looked at those 3 small figures bound like sacrificial offerings, she knew the spirits had brought her here for a purpose greater than her own survival. $25. She called out in a voice that carried across the plaza like the cry of a hunting eagle. For all 3 boys. The crowd turned to stare at her as if she had materialized from the desert air itself. An Apache woman at a white settlement was unusual enough, but one with the audacity to bid against white men for white children was practically unheard of in this corner of the Arizona territory. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance, from her intricately beaded moccasins to the silver and turquoise jewelry that marked her as a woman of status among her people. "Ma'am, you sure you know what you're bidding on? These are white children, and they'll need proper Christian upbringing, not savage ways." His words dripped with the casual racism that had poisoned relations between their peoples for generations. But Senna had endured worse insults than this small-minded man could imagine. "I have 25 silver dollars," she replied her. English perfect, but accented with the musical cadences of her native tongue.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Is that sufficient for your auction, or do you prefer to conduct business based on the color of a person's skin rather than the weight of their coin? Her challenge hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, and several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the steel beneath her calm exterior. The man with the scarred hands who had bid $15 stepped forward with the swagger of someone accustomed to intimidating others into submission. "Now hold on there, squaw. These boys need to go to Christian families who can raise them proper. What's an Indian want with white children anyway? Planning to turn them into savages like yourself?" His words carried the casual cruelty of a man who had never questioned his own superiority, and several others in the crowd murmured their agreement. Senna met his gaze with the unflinching stare of a woman who had watched cavalry soldiers burn her village and had still found the strength to rebuild. "These children need food, shelter, and safety," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived trials this man could never imagine. "I can provide all three. Can you say the same about your mountain work camp, or will you work them to death before they see another winter?" Her words cut through his bluster like a sharp knife through rotten rope. The smallest boy had gone very still, his head tilted as if he were listening intently to her voice. Even through the burlap sack, she could sense his attention focused on her like sunlight through a magnifying glass. Whatever connection existed between them, whatever impossible knowledge had allowed him to speak her name, it grew stronger with each word she spoke in his defense. $30, growled the scarred man, his face reddening with anger at being challenged by someone he considered beneath his station. "And that's my final offer. These boys need discipline and hard work, not coddling from some heathen woman who doesn't know the first thing about raising Christian children." The crowd murmured its approval, many nodding as if they agreed with his assessment of the situation. Senna reached into her leather pouch and counted out coins with the methodical precision of someone making a sacred offering. 35 silver dollars, nearly everything she owned in the white man's currency. But she had learned long ago that some things were worth more than money. $35, she announced, her voice carrying across the plaza with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. In silver coin, counted and ready. She held up the money so that everyone could see she was not bluffing. The auctioneer's greed overcame his prejudice as he stared at the gleaming silver in her dark hands. $35 was more than he had expected to get for 3 orphaned children, and money spent just as well regardless of who offered it. 35 going once, he called out, his gavel poised above his wooden block like an executioner's axe. Going twice. He looked around the crowd for any final bids, but even the scarred man seemed reluctant to go higher for what he had probably viewed as cheap labor. Sold to the Apache woman for $35. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the desert like the sound of fate being sealed. Senna felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over her as she realized what she had just done. In the space of a few minutes, she had gone from a woman planning to buy winter supplies to the guardian of 3 white children in a territory where such arrangements were viewed with suspicion at best and outright hostility at worst. The auctioneer gestured impatiently for her to approach the platform. "Come collect your property, man, and we'll get those sacks off their heads so you can see what you bought." His casual reference to the children as property made her stomach clench, but she forced herself to walk calmly toward the wooden platform, where 3 young lives hung in the balance of her decision. As she climbed the rough wooden steps, Senna could feel the weight of dozens of hostile stares boring into her back like arrows. The crowd had not dispersed after the sale, and many seemed eager to see what would happen when the mysterious connection between an Apache woman and 3 white orphans was finally revealed. The tension in the air felt thick enough to cut with. A knife, and she knew that her troubles were just beginning. The auctioneer produced a rusty knife and began cutting the ropes that held the burlap sacks in place. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered, his hands rough and careless as he worked. The first sack came off the tallest boy, revealing a face that was thin and dirty, but marked by intelligent brown eyes and a stubborn jaw that suggested he had not been broken by whatever hardships had brought him to this place. He blinked in. The sudden sunlight, like a nocturnal creature forced into the day. The second sack revealed a boy with sandy hair and green eyes that burned with barely suppressed rage. His lips were pressed together in a tight line, and his whole body radiated the coiled tension of someone preparing to fight or flee at the first opportunity. When his gaze met Senna's, she saw a mixture of fear and defiance that reminded her of a young wolf caught in a trap. But it was the third and smallest boy who made her breath catch in her throat like a fishbone. As the burlap fell away from his face, she found herself staring into eyes the color of summer sky, blue as the sacred lakes in the high mountains where her people went to pray. His hair was the pale gold of winter grass, and his features were delicate as carved bone, but it was his expression that stopped her heart. He looked at her with the calm recognition of someone greeting an old friend, his small face breaking into a smile that transformed his entire appearance from that of a frightened orphan to something approaching joy. "I knew you would come," he said in that same careful Apache pronunciation that had first caught her attention. "The grandmother in my dreams said you would find us when the time was right." His words fell into the sudden silence of the crowd like stones into a still pond. Senna knelt before him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his small face to convince herself that this moment was real and not some fever dream brought on by too much desert sun. "What grandmother, little one?" she asked in her native tongue, not caring who in the crowd might understand. "What dreams?" Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she waited for his answer. The boy's smile widened, and he replied in Apache that was halting but unmistakably genuine. "The grandmother with silver hair who walks in the spirit world. She said her granddaughter would come to save us when we needed her most. She said to tell you that Thunder Eagle sends his love from the place where warriors go to rest." The words hit Senna like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and making her stagger backward as if she had been struck by lightning. Thunder Eagle had been her husband's name, a name this child could not possibly know. Her husband's grandmother, a revered medicine woman named Silver Moon, had passed into the spirit world the winter before Thunder Eagle's death, and Senna had never spoken of her to anyone outside the tribe. Yet this small white boy spoke of them both with the casual familiarity of someone who had sat by campfires listening to the old stories. The crowd had gone silent as death, sensing that something profound was happening, even if they could not understand the Apache words being spoken. The older two boys watched their youngest companion with expressions of amazement, as if they too were witnessing something beyond their comprehension. The scarred man who had bid against her pushed forward through the crowd, his face twisted with suspicion and anger. "What's that savage talk?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the moment like a blade through silk. "What's that boy saying to you, woman? If you're filling his head with heathen nonsense, there will be consequences. These are Christian children, and they don't need your devil worship corrupting their souls." His words carried the weight of centuries of fear and misunderstanding. But Senna barely heard him through the roaring in her ears. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady as a newborn colt's, and gathered the three boys to her like a mother bird sheltering her chicks. The oldest boy, whom she would later learn was named Tobias, looked up at her with eyes that held more wisdom than any 12-year-old should possess. The middle boy, Samuel, had stopped radiating anger and now watched her with curious attention. And little Ben, the child who had somehow bridged the gap between the spirit world and the land of the living, took her hand with the trust of someone who had finally found what he had been searching for. The ride back to Apache territory stretched across 20 miles of unforgiving desert terrain, where the sun beat down like the hammer of an angry god, and mirages danced on the horizon like spirits playing tricks on weary travelers. Senna had fashioned a makeshift travois from cottonwood poles and horse blankets, allowing the three boys to ride behind her mare while she walked alongside, leading them away from the hostile stares and whispered threats that had followed them. Out of Copper Mesa, the boys had not spoken since leaving the settlement, their eyes wide with the shock of finding themselves in the care of an Apache woman whose very existence challenged everything they had been taught about the world. Little Ben rode in the center of the travois, his small hands clutching the leather straps that Senna had secured around the wooden frame. Despite the jarring motion of the makeshift sled over rocky ground, he seemed calmer than his older companions, his blue eyes fixed on Senna's back with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail of her movements. Tobias sat at the front, his 12-year-old frame rigid with the responsibility he felt for his younger companions, while Samuel occupied the rear position, his green eyes constantly scanning the desert landscape as if expecting attackers to emerge from behind every sagebrush and boulder. The first real test of their unlikely bond came when they stopped at a natural spring, hidden among red sandstone formations that rose from the desert floor like the bones of ancient giants. Senna had discovered this oasis during her first trading expedition to white settlements, and she had kept its location secret even from other Apache travelers, knowing that such places were sacred gifts that should not be shared carelessly. The water bubbled up from deep underground, filtered through countless layers of rock until it emerged crystal clear and cold enough to make teeth ache. "Drink slowly," Senna instructed as she helped the boys down from the travois, her hands gentle but firm as she guided them toward the spring. "Desert water is like medicine. Too much too fast will make you sick, but the right amount will heal whatever ails you." She demonstrated by cupping her hands and taking small sips, her movements deliberate and reverent as she honored the spirit of the water that had sustained her people for countless generations. Tobias was the first to follow her example, his natural leadership asserting itself as he helped Samuel and little Ben approach the spring with the caution she had recommended. But it was Samuel who surprised her by kneeling beside the water and placing his palm flat against the sandstone that formed the spring's edge, his young face serious with concentration, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "The rocks are singing," Samuel said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of wonder that transformed his previously sullen expression. "I can feel it through my hand like they're humming a song that's been going on forever." His words made Senna's breath catch in her throat, because the ability to hear the song of the stones was considered a rare gift among her people, something that usually manifested only in those destined to become medicine people or spiritual leaders. Little Ben nodded solemnly, as if Samuel's observation was perfectly natural. "The grandmother in my dream said the earth has its own voice, but most people forget how to listen. She said we would remember when we found our true family." His matter-of-fact delivery of such profound spiritual insight sent chills down Senna's spine, because he spoke with the casual wisdom of a child who had been touched by forces beyond the ordinary world. As the afternoon shadows grew longer and the desert heat began to subside, Senna made the decision to share something with the boys that she had never revealed to any white person. From her medicine pouch, she withdrew a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin, unfolding it to reveal a collection of sacred items that had belonged to her grandmother's grandmother: polished stones from the holy mountains, dried herbs that held the power of healing, and a small piece of turquoise carved in the shape of a thunderbird. "Among my people," she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a storyteller sharing ancient wisdom, "we believe that some souls are born into the wrong bodies, or find themselves walking paths that seem to lead away from their true destiny. But the spirits are always watching, always working to guide those souls back to where they belong." She placed the turquoise thunderbird in little Ben's small palm, watching as his fingers closed around it with the reverence of someone handling A sacred relic. The boy's eyes grew wide as he felt the carved stone's warmth spreading through his hand like captured sunlight. "It's alive," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "I can feel its heartbeat." His words confirmed what Senna had begun to suspect, that this child possessed a spiritual sensitivity that transcended the boundaries of race and culture, connecting him to the deeper mysteries that most people spent their entire lives seeking. To understand, Tobias watched the exchange with the protective intensity of an older brother, who had learned to shield his siblings from a world that seemed determined to hurt them. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his young voice trying to sound more mature than his years, "we're grateful for what you did back there, buying us and all. But we don't understand why you'd spend your money on 3 orphan boys you'd never seen before. What do you want from us?" His question carried the weight of experience with adults who always wanted something in return for their apparent kindness. Senna considered her answer carefully, knowing that these children had learned to distrust the motives of grown-ups through bitter experience. "In my culture," she said finally, "we believe that children are gifts from the Creator, sacred beings who carry pieces of the future in their hearts. When I saw you 3 on that platform, bound and hooded like animals being sold for slaughter, I heard my ancestors' voices telling me that this was a moment that would echo through generations yet unborn." She paused, watching their faces as they tried to process concepts that challenged everything they had been taught about Indian savagery and civilization. Samuel's hand was still pressed against the singing stones of the spring, and his expression had taken on a dreamy quality, as if he were receiving visions from some otherworldly source. "There's something moving in the water," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something with silver scales and eyes like stars." The other boys leaned forward to look, but Senna remained perfectly still, recognizing the signs of a spiritual vision that should not be interrupted. "What does it tell you?" she asked gently, her tone respectful of the sacred nature of what Samuel was experiencing. Among her people, visions that came near holy water were considered especially powerful, carrying messages that could guide important decisions or reveal hidden truths about the future. Samuel's breathing had become deep and regular, as if he were in a trance state that allowed him to perceive things beyond the physical world. "It says that we were lost, but now we're found, that we were broken, but now we'll be made whole. It says that the old grandmother who watches over little Ben has been waiting for this day since before any of us were born." His words carried the authority of prophecy, spoken with a conviction that made even Tobias stop fidgeting and pay attention. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the very air on fire, Senna made another decision that would have shocked the white settlers of Copper Mesa. She began to teach the boys the rudiments of Apache survival skills, starting with the ability to read the subtle signs that the desert used to communicate with those who knew its language. "See how the shadows fall differently near that cluster of prickly pear?" she asked, pointing to a stand of cacti about 50 yards from their resting place. "That tells us there's water underground, probably close enough to reach by digging. And notice how the birds fly in circles over that rocky outcrop to the north? They're marking the location of a cave or overhang where we could shelter if a storm comes up." Her lessons were practical but touched with the spiritual reverence that her people brought to all interactions with the natural world. Little Ben proved to be the most receptive student, his young mind seeming to absorb the desert's secrets with the ease of a sponge soaking up water. Within minutes of Senna's explanation, he was pointing out animal tracks in the sand, identifying the differences between the prints left by rabbits and those made by prairie dogs, his small finger tracing the subtle variations that indicated the age and direction of travel. The jackrabbit that made these tracks was injured, he observed, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone stating an obvious fact. "See how the left hind paw drags just a little? And these other prints here belong to a coyote that was following the rabbit's trail. But the coyote gave up the hunt because the wind changed direction and carried away the scent. His analysis was so accurate that Senna felt a chill of recognition. Because such detailed tracking skills usually took years to develop, as twilight painted the desert in shades of purple and silver, they reached the hidden canyon where Senna had made her home since Thunder Eagle's death. The entrance was concealed behind a curtain of hanging vines and flowering bushes that grew from springs seeping out of the canyon walls, creating a natural barrier that made the opening nearly invisible to casual observers. Inside, the canyon opened into a sheltered valley where cottonwood trees provided shade and a clear stream meandered between banks lined with wildflowers. The boys' eyes widened as they followed Senna through the secret entrance, their faces reflecting amazement at finding such a paradise hidden in the harsh desert landscape. Her dwelling was a traditional Apache wickiup constructed from curved wooden poles and covered with woven grass mats and animal hides. But it also built a small adobe structure for storing food and supplies during the harsh winter months. "This is your home now," Senna said simply, her words carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "For as long as you choose to stay, you will be safe here, protected by the spirits of this place and by the love of a woman who has learned that family is not always determined by blood." Her declaration hung in the evening air like incense, sanctifying a moment that would be remembered by all of them for the rest of their lives. That first night in the hidden canyon revealed depths to the boys' characters that had been concealed by their circumstances as orphans and auction commodities. Tobias demonstrated a natural aptitude for practical tasks, helping Senna prepare their evening meal with the efficiency of someone who had learned to be useful in order to survive. He gathered firewood with careful attention to selecting pieces that would burn cleanly and long, and he arranged the cooking stones with the precision of someone who understood that such details could mean the difference between comfort and misery. Samuel surprised them all by revealing a gift for music that had been suppressed during his hard years of institutional care. When Senna produced a traditional Apache flute carved from hollow reed, he held it as if it were made of precious metal, his fingers finding the holes with instinctive grace. The melody he coaxed from the simple instrument was hauntingly beautiful, a wordless song that seemed to capture the loneliness of his past and the hope of his uncertain future. Little Ben's contribution to their first evening together was perhaps the most remarkable of all. As they sat around the flickering campfire with their bellies full of rabbit stew and their hearts beginning to open to the possibility of belonging somewhere, he began to speak of his dreams with the casual authority of someone reporting the weather. According to his account, the spirit grandmother who had guided him to Senna was not finished with her interventions in their lives. "She says there will be troubles coming," Ben reported, his young voice matter-of-fact despite the weight of his predictions. "Men with badges and guns who don't understand that love can cross the boundaries that people try to build between different kinds of families. She says we'll have to be strong and clever, and that we'll need to trust each other completely if we want to stay together." His words sent a chill through the group, because they all sensed the truth in his vision. Senna spent that first night lying awake on her sleeping blankets, listening to the boys' breathing as they slept beside the dying embers of their fire. Tobias made small sounds in his sleep, as if he were fighting battles even in his dreams. Samuel's breathing was deep and peaceful, as if the music he had played had somehow exorcised demons that had been troubling his spirit. But it was little Ben's sleep that fascinated her most, because even in unconsciousness, he seemed to be having conversations with invisible companions, his lips moving silently as if he were receiving instructions from the spirit world. The next morning brought their first real test as an unlikely family when a hunting party of Apache warriors arrived at the canyon entrance, drawn by the smoke from their fire and curious about who had taken up residence in what they considered tribal territory. Senna recognized the leader as Joseph Crowfeather, a respected war chief who had known her husband and who viewed white encroachment on Apache lands with the justified suspicion of someone who had seen too many treaties broken and too many promises Forgotten, sister, Crowfeather said formally, his dark eyes taking in the three white boys who stood protectively close to Senna's side. We heard that you had taken captives from the white settlement, but we did not expect to find you raising white children like your own cubs. His tone was carefully neutral, but Senna could hear the underlying tension that came from a lifetime of conflict between his people and the race represented by her three charges. Little Ben stepped forward before Senna could respond, his small frame dwarfed by the mounted warriors, but his voice clear and unafraid as he addressed Crowfeather in halting but sincere Apache. Honored war chief, we are not captives, but children who have found our true mother. The spirits have spoken, and we belong with Senna Ravensky as surely as eagles belong to the sky. His words, delivered with the formal courtesy that Apache children were taught to show their elders, created a moment of stunned silence among the warriors. Crowfeather dismounted from his painted pony and knelt to bring his face level with Little Ben's, studying the boy's features with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. White child, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of wonder, you speak our language with respect and you show proper manners to your elders. Who taught you these things? His question was more than casual curiosity, it was an examination that would determine whether these children could be accepted into the complex social structure of Apache society. The grandmother who walks in dreams, Ben replied without hesitation, his blue eyes meeting the war chief's dark gaze with unwavering honesty. She said that words carry power, and that showing respect to warriors and elders is the first law of people who want to live in harmony with the spirits of the land. His answer demonstrated an understanding of Apache values that went far beyond mere language lessons, suggesting a spiritual connection that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. The testing continued throughout the morning as Crowfeather and his warriors observed the boys' interactions with Senna and their adaptation to life in an Apache environment. They watched Tobias help repair a section of the wickiup that had been damaged by recent rains, his hands steady and sure as he worked with materials that were completely foreign to his previous experience. They observed Samuel's reverent behavior around the sacred spring that provided water for the canyon, noting how he asked permission before drinking and offered thanks afterward. But it was Little Ben's behavior during the warriors' visit that truly convinced them of the spiritual forces at work in this situation. When Crowfeather performed a brief ceremony to honor the spirits of the canyon, the young boy participated with the natural grace of someone who had been raised in Apache traditions, his small voice joining the chanted prayers with an accuracy that amazed even Senna. As the sun reached its zenith and the warriors prepared to leave, Crowfeather pulled Senna aside for a private conversation that would determine the future of her unconventional family. Sister, he said quietly, his weathered face serious with the weight of leadership, what you have done is unprecedented in memory of our people. White children raised as Apache, learning our ways and speaking our language, it could be seen as an abomination or as a miracle, depending on one's perspective. He paused, studying her face for signs of doubt or uncertainty. I have consulted with the spirits, Senna replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had received divine guidance, and they have shown me that these children are gifts that will bring healing to wounds that have festered between our peoples for too many generations. They are bridges that span the gap between two worlds, and their presence here is part of a larger plan that we are only beginning to understand. Her words carried the authority of prophecy, spoken with a conviction that made Crowfeather nod slowly in recognition of forces beyond human control. The war chief's decision came after a long moment of contemplation, during which he seemed to be weighing factors that only he could perceive. We will support you in this, he said finally, his words carrying the weight of tribal law. But know that there will be challenges ahead that will test not only your resolve, but the strength of the bonds you are building with these white children. The spirits may have brought them to you, but it will be up to all of you to prove that This arrangement serves the greater good of both peoples. His warning was both blessing and burden, acknowledging the spiritual significance of what was happening while recognizing the practical difficulties that lay ahead. That evening, as the boys sat around their fire listening to Senna tell traditional Apache stories of Coyote, the trickster, and the first emergence of human beings into the world of light, little Ben made an observation that would prove prophetic in ways none of them could imagine. "The grandmother says that tomorrow we begin learning the harder lessons," he said quietly, his young voice carrying the weight of supernatural knowledge, "the ones that will teach us how to be strong when people try to tear our family apart." His words fell into the gathering darkness like stones dropped into a deep well, creating ripples that would spread far beyond their small canyon refuge. 3 weeks after the Apache War Council had given their blessing to Senna's unconventional family, the first harbinger of trouble arrived in the form of a dust cloud on the eastern horizon that moved with the deliberate pace of men on horseback who carried official authority in their saddlebags. Little Ben spotted them first from his favorite perch atop the red sandstone formation that guarded the canyon's entrance, his young eyes sharp enough to count the riders and identify the glint of metal badges that caught the morning sunlight like signals of approaching doom. 5 men coming from the direction of the territorial capital. He called down to where Senna was teaching Tobias the intricate art of weaving grass baskets strong enough to carry water without leaking. They ride like soldiers but dress like lawmen, and the one in front carries papers in a leather case that he protects like sacred medicine. His report carried the matter-of-fact precision that had become his trademark, delivered without fear, but with the understanding that this moment marked the end of their peaceful isolation. Senna's hands stilled on the half-finished basket as she processed the implications of what little Ben had observed. In the weeks since bringing the boys to her hidden sanctuary, she had lived with the constant awareness that their situation was too unusual, too challenging to established order, to remain undiscovered indefinitely. The territorial government, already struggling to maintain control over a region where Apache resistance movements still flared like wildfire, would view a white woman raising Apache children, or an Apache woman raising white children, as equally threatening to their carefully maintained racial boundaries. "Tobias," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced government officials before and understood their capacity for both bureaucratic blindness and arbitrary cruelty. "Take Samuel and gather the emergency supplies we prepared. Hide them in the sacred cave behind the waterfall, and stay there until I come for you, or until little Ben brings word that it's safe to return." Her contingency planning had included preparing for exactly this scenario, though she had hoped it would never become necessary. The older boy's face had matured considerably during their 3 weeks together, losing some of its childish roundness and gaining the angular determination of someone who had learned to shoulder responsibilities beyond his years. "What about you and Ben?" he asked, his brown eyes reflecting the protective instincts that had kept his younger companions alive through their darkest times. "We're not leaving you to face those men alone, not after everything you've done for us." His loyalty was fierce and unquestioning, born from the first real security he had known since becoming an orphan. "Little Ben and I will handle the officials," Senna replied, her tone brooking no argument despite the warmth in her eyes, as she recognized his courage. "His gift for seeing truth in people's hearts will help us understand what they really want, and my experience with government bureaucrats will help us give them just enough cooperation to satisfy their immediate demands without revealing anything that could harm our family." She had learned through bitter experience that survival often depended on appearing to comply, while actually revealing nothing of importance. Samuel emerged from the wickiup where he had been practicing traditional Apache flute melodies, his green eyes immediately assessing the tension in the air with the sensitivity of someone who had developed survival instincts during his hardest years. "How much time do we have?" he asked, His question directed to little Ben with the understanding that the youngest boy's supernatural awareness often provided more accurate intelligence than conventional observation. They'll reach the canyon entrance within the hour. Ben replied, his blue eyes distant as if he were consulting sources of information that existed beyond the physical world. The man with the papers is named Henderson, and he carries orders from the territorial governor to investigate reports of irregular racial mixing and unauthorized custody arrangements. He believes he's conducting a routine inspection, but there are forces at work that he doesn't understand. His analysis combined practical observation with spiritual insight in ways that continued to amaze even Senna. The next 30 minutes passed in a flurry of carefully rehearsed preparations, as the family implemented the emergency protocols they had hoped never to use. Tobias and Samuel disappeared into the labyrinthine passages that honeycombed the canyon walls, carrying enough supplies to sustain them for several days if necessary. Their hiding place was a sacred cave known only to a few Apache medicine people, protected by both natural camouflage and spiritual guardians that would confuse anyone who tried to locate it without proper guidance. Senna spent those precious minutes transforming herself from an Apache woman living in traditional ways to someone who might appear more acceptable to territorial officials. She braided her long black hair in a severe style that suggested Christian influence, donned a simple dress that could have come from any frontier settlement, and concealed her traditional jewelry in favor of a plain silver cross that had belonged to a missionary who had tried unsuccessfully to convert her village years earlier. Little Ben required no such transformation, his innocent appearance and natural charm serving as the perfect cover for abilities that would have been considered either miraculous or demonic depending on the observer's perspective. However, Senna did coach him on how to modify his speech patterns to sound more like a typical frontier child and less like someone who had been receiving spiritual instruction from Apache ancestors. Remember, she told him as they heard the sound of approaching horses echoing off the canyon walls, you are a boy who has been living with a kind woman who rescued you from hardship. You don't need to mention your dreams or the wisdom that the grandmother shares with you. Let them see only what they expect to see, a grateful child who has found safety and love. Her instructions were both practical and protective, designed to shield his gifts from people who would neither understand nor appreciate their significance. The 5 riders who emerged from the concealed canyon entrance were exactly what little Ben's vision had predicted. Territorial officials dressed in the dusty, black suits that marked them as representatives of distant authority, their faces bearing the expressions of men who had traveled far to investigate something they considered both distasteful and potentially dangerous. The leader, a thin man with steel gray hair and eyes like chips of flint, dismounted with the stiff movements of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in a saddle. Mrs. Crow, I presume? Henderson said, consulting a notebook filled with cramped handwriting that documented the various reports and complaints that had reached territorial headquarters. I am Inspector Henderson from the Office of Territorial Administration, and I'm here to investigate certain irregularities regarding the custody and care of minor children that have been brought to our attention. His formal language carried the weight of bureaucratic authority, but Senna detected uncertainty beneath his official demeanor. I am Senna Ravensky, she replied, deliberately using her Apache name rather than accepting his mispronunciation. And this is my home where I care for children who have nowhere else to go. How may I assist your investigation? Her response was polite but not deferential, establishing immediately that she would cooperate within limits while maintaining her dignity and authority over her own domain. Henderson's eyebrows rose at her confident manner and educated speech, clearly not expecting to encounter an articulate Apache woman who could engage with territorial authority on equal terms. Mrs. Ravensky, he said, struggling slightly with the pronunciation, we have received reports that you purchased 3 white children at a public auction in Copper Mesa. and that you are currently housing them in conditions that may not meet territorial standards for child welfare. His words carried the implicit threat of official intervention. Little Ben stepped forward with the perfect timing of someone who understood dramatic effect, his blue eyes wide with the innocent appeal that had charmed everyone from Apache war chiefs to suspicious government officials. "Sir," he said in carefully modulated English that contained no trace of Apache influence, "Mrs. Ravensky saved us from people who wanted to hurt us. She feeds us every day, teaches us important things, and makes sure we're safe and warm. Isn't that what good mothers are supposed to do?" His question was delivered with such genuine sincerity that even Henderson's stern expression softened slightly. The inspector's three companions began examining the canyon settlement with the systematic thoroughness of men trained to assess living conditions and identify potential violations of territorial regulations. They noted the clean water supply, the adequate shelter, the well-maintained food storage areas, and the obvious signs that children were receiving proper care and attention. However, their cultural biases made them suspicious of anything that deviated from white frontier norms. "Where are the other two children mentioned in our reports?" asked Deputy Morrison, a heavyset man with suspicious eyes who had built his career on finding fault with arrangements that challenged established social order. "We were told that 3 boys were purchased at the auction, but I only see 1 child present." His question carried the implication that something sinister might have befallen the missing boys. Senna had anticipated this inquiry and prepared an explanation that was technically truthful while revealing nothing that could endanger Tobias and Samuel. "The older boys are attending to important tasks that require them to be away from the camp for extended periods," she said calmly. "They are learning skills that will serve them well as they grow toward manhood, including hunting, tracking, and understanding the ways of the desert that could save their lives in emergency situations." Her answer suggested a reasonable educational activity rather than deliberate concealment. Henderson made careful notes in his leather-bound journal, documenting details that would form the basis of his official report to territorial headquarters. "Mrs. Ravensky," he said after several minutes of writing, "while your living arrangements appear adequate for basic survival needs, there are concerns about the cultural influences to which these children are being exposed. Territorial law requires that all minor children receive proper Christian education and preparation for useful citizenship in American society." His words carried the weight of legal authority backed by the power to remove children from situations deemed inappropriate. "I understand your concerns," Senna replied, her tone respectful but firm, "and I want to assure you that these children are receiving moral instruction that emphasizes honesty, respect for authority, hard work, and concern for others less fortunate than themselves. Are these not the fundamental values that all good Americans seek to instill in their young people?" Her response cleverly reframed Apache values in terms that territorial officials would find difficult to criticize. Little Ben chose that moment to demonstrate exactly the kind of moral instruction he had been receiving by offering to share his lunch with the officials, who had been traveling since dawn without stopping to eat. His gesture of hospitality, delivered with the gracious formality that Apache children learn from their earliest years, created an awkward moment for men who had come prepared to find evidence of savage influence corrupting innocent white children. The afternoon progressed with a series of carefully orchestrated demonstrations designed to satisfy the officials' concerns while revealing nothing that could be used against their family. Senna showed them the educational materials she used to teach reading and arithmetic, carefully selecting examples that emphasized practical skills rather than traditional Apache knowledge. She displayed the boys' improving handwriting and their ability to recite passages from literature that promoted values of industry and moral behavior. However, the real test came when Deputy Morrison discovered several items that clearly belonged to traditional Apache culture. A collection of beautifully crafted baskets, traditional hunting tools, and ceremonial objects that held deep spiritual significance for Senna's people. His eyes lit up with the satisfaction of someone who had found evidence to support his predetermined conclusions about the dangers of racial mixing. What are these heathen artifacts doing in a place where Christian children are being raised? Morrison demanded, his voice carrying the righteous indignation of someone who saw his own prejudices confirmed by physical evidence. How can we be sure that these boys aren't being filled with savage superstitions and taught to reject the civilized values that will make them productive members of American society? His questions were designed to trap Senna in admissions that could be used to justify removing the children from her care. Little Ben's response demonstrated the sophisticated understanding that had developed during his weeks of living between two cultures. Those things belonged to Mrs. Ravensky's family, he said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone explaining something obvious to adults who seemed surprisingly slow to understand. She keeps them because they remind her of people she loved who have died, just like how some folks keep their grandmother's Bible or their father's pocket watch. She told me that remembering the good things about people who are gone helps us be better people ourselves. His explanation reframed traditional Apache objects as sentimental keepsakes rather than instruments of cultural corruption. Henderson's investigation continued for the remainder of the day as he meticulously documented every aspect of the canyon settlement that might be relevant to his official report. He measured the dimensions of the living quarters, tested the quality of the water supply, examined the food storage areas for signs of adequate nutrition, and observed Little Ben's behavior for evidence of proper moral development and educational progress. As evening approached and the officials prepared to depart, Henderson delivered what amounted to a conditional verdict on the arrangement he had been sent to investigate. "Mrs. Ravensky," he said formally, his words carrying the weight of territorial law, "while your care of this child appears adequate for his immediate physical needs, there remain serious concerns about the long-term implications of his current educational and cultural environment." He paused to consult his notes before continuing with the bureaucratic precision that characterized all official pronouncements. "Therefore," Henderson continued, "I am recommending that this arrangement be allowed to continue for a probationary period of 3 months, during which time you will be expected to demonstrate measurable progress in preparing this child for eventual integration into mainstream American society. Additionally, you will be required to produce the other 2 children for official inspection within 30 days, and to provide documentation of their educational progress and moral development." His conditions were designed to appear reasonable, while creating opportunities for future interference. After the officials departed, their horses' hoofbeats fading into the desert twilight like the echo of distant thunder, Senna and Little Ben sat beside their evening fire contemplating the challenges that lay ahead. The inspection had gone better than either of them had dared hope, but the conditional nature of their victory meant that greater trials awaited them in the weeks and months to come. "The grandmother says this was only the first test, Little Ben reported quietly, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames as he shared the spiritual guidance that continued to flow through his dreams. "She says that the men who came today were messengers rather than true enemies, but that real danger is gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. There are people in the territorial capital who see our family as a threat to their plans for keeping white people and Apache people separated forever." His words carried the weight of prophecy, spoken with the casual authority of someone reporting facts rather than fears. That night, as Tobias and Samuel emerged from their hiding place to hear about the day's events, the family held a council meeting to discuss the new realities they would need to navigate. The boys had matured considerably during their time in the canyon, developing not only survival skills and cultural understanding, but also the kind of strategic thinking that would be essential for protecting their unconventional family from forces that sought to destroy it. "We need to be smarter than they are," Tobias observed, his 12-year-old mind grappling with complexities that would have challenged adults. They want to separate us because they think we're dangerous to their way of organizing the world. So we have to prove that we're more valuable together than apart, that what we've learned from each other makes us better people than we were before. His insight demonstrated the leadership qualities that had been developing since he took responsibility for his younger companions. Samuel's contribution to their planning session reflected his growing understanding of the spiritual dimensions of their situation. The music that flows through this place tells me that we're part of something larger than just one family trying to stay together, he said, his green eyes bright with inspiration. We're like the first notes of a song that could bring healing between peoples who have been enemies for too long. But songs can be interrupted if the musicians aren't careful about timing and harmony. His metaphor captured both the hope and the fragility of their position. As the fire burned low and the canyon settled into the peaceful quiet of another night, Senna found herself thinking about the words Thunder Eagle had spoken during their last conversation before his death. He had told her that love was the strongest medicine in the world, capable of healing wounds that seemed too deep to mend, but that it required courage to apply love in situations where hatred and fear had taken root. Looking at the three boys who had become her children through choice rather than blood, she understood that their family represented exactly the kind of healing her husband had envisioned. The next morning brought news that confirmed little Ben's prophetic warnings about gathering storms. A rider arrived at dawn carrying a message from Crow Feather that federal agents had been asking questions in Apache settlements about reports of white children living among the tribes. The territorial investigation had apparently triggered interest at even higher levels of government, where officials viewed any blurring of racial boundaries as potentially dangerous to their policies of segregation and control. Federal agents are different from territorial inspectors, Senna explained to the boys as they gathered around their breakfast fire to discuss this new development. They have more authority, more resources, and less patience with arrangements. That challenged their understanding of how the world should be organized. If they decide that our family represents a threat to their policies, they will have the power to separate us permanently. Her words were sobering but necessary, preparing the children for challenges that would test everything they had learned about courage, loyalty, and the power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Little Ben's response demonstrated the spiritual maturity that continued to amaze everyone who knew him. The grandmother says that federal agents are like winter storms, dangerous and powerful, but temporary. She says that if we remember who we really are and trust in the bonds that connect our hearts, we can survive anything that men with badges and papers can do to us. His words carried the quiet confidence of someone who had received assurance from sources beyond the physical world. As they prepared for whatever trials lay ahead, each member of their unusual family drew strength from the others in ways that transcended the boundaries of race and culture that the outside world insisted were insurmountable. They had become living proof that love could indeed bridge any gap, heal any wound, and overcome any obstacle when it was applied with wisdom, courage, and unwavering commitment to the truth that all human beings were children of the same Creator. The federal agents arrived like an iron fist wrapped in legal documents, their black carriages creating dust clouds that could be seen for miles across the desert landscape as they approached the canyon with the inexorable momentum of a cavalry charge. Unlike the territorial officials who had conducted their investigation with bureaucratic thoroughness, these men carried themselves with the cold efficiency of soldiers who had been ordered to solve a problem rather than merely investigate one. Little Ben's supernatural vision had provided 3 days' warning of their approach, allowing the family to implement their most desperate contingency plan, a strategy that would either save them all or destroy everything they had built together. Agent Marcus Blackwood stepped down from the lead carriage with the predatory grace of a man who had built his career on dismantling arrangements that challenged federal authority. His steel-gray uniform bore the crisp creases of someone who viewed military precision as both professional requirement and personal philosophy. while his pale eyes surveyed the canyon settlement with the calculating assessment of someone cataloging evidence for a predetermined conclusion. Behind him, 4 additional agents emerged like shadows given human form, their hands resting casually on the holstered weapons that represented the ultimate argument in any dispute with federal power. "Mrs. Ravensky," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying the metallic ring of authority that brooked no contradiction. "I am Agent Blackwood of the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I am here to execute a warrant for the immediate removal of 3 minor children who have been illegally removed from appropriate custody and placed in an environment that poses significant risks to their moral and physical development." He produced a leather portfolio containing documents that bore official seals and signatures, the paper weapons that federal bureaucrats wielded with greater devastation than rifles or cannons. Senna emerged from her wickiup wearing the ceremonial dress that marked her as a woman of status among her people, her silver and turquoise jewelry gleaming in the afternoon sunlight like armor forged from the earth itself. She had made the deliberate decision to meet this threat as an Apache leader, rather than a frontier woman trying to pass for white acceptance, understanding that their only hope lay in forcing the federal agents to confront the full complexity of what they were attempting to destroy. "Agent Blackwood," she replied with the formal courtesy that Apache diplomacy required even in the face of naked aggression. "You are welcome in my home as custom demands. But I must inform you that the children you seek are not prisoners or captives, but beloved members of a family joined by bonds stronger than blood or law. If you wish to remove them, you will need to explain how federal authority supersedes the sacred obligations of love and protection." Her words carried the weight of both personal conviction and cultural tradition. The agent's pale eyes narrowed as he processed this unexpected response, clearly prepared for defiance but not for a challenge couched in terms that transformed him from rescuer to aggressor. "Mrs. Ravensky," he said, his tone hardening like cooling metal, "federal law recognizes no sacred obligations that permit white children to be raised outside Christian civilization by individuals whose cultural practices are fundamentally incompatible with American values. These children will be removed to appropriate facilities where they can receive proper education and moral guidance." His pronouncement carried the finality of a court judgment. Little Ben appeared at Senna's side with the perfect timing that had become his trademark, his small hand slipping into hers, with a gesture that spoke more eloquently than any legal argument about the nature of their relationship. However, the child who faced Agent Blackwood bore little resemblance to the charming boy who had deflected territorial suspicions 3 weeks earlier. This version of Ben radiated a spiritual authority that seemed to bend the very air around him, his blue eyes holding depths that suggested direct connection to forces beyond federal jurisdiction. "Agent Blackwood," the 7-year-old said with the formal precision of someone delivering an official pronouncement, "My brothers and I have discussed your arrival, and we have decided that we will not cooperate with any attempt to separate our family. We have found our true home here, and no government document can change the reality of love that has already been written in our hearts." His words carried an adult weight of conviction that made the federal agents shift uncomfortably. Before Blackwood could respond to this unexpected resistance, Tobias and Samuel emerged from concealment with the dramatic flair of warriors accepting a final challenge. The week since the territorial inspection had transformed them from hidden refugees into young men ready to fight for everything they held dear. Tobias carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who had been trained in traditional Apache weapons, while Samuel's presence seemed to resonate with musical harmony that made the very stones of the canyon hum with sympathetic vibration. "We're not going anywhere," Tobias announced, his 12-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who had been forced to become a man before his time. "You can drag us away in chains if you have the stomach for it, but you can't make us forget who we really are, or betray the woman who gave us life when the whole world had given up on us." His defiance was absolute, the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. Samuel's contribution to their resistance was characteristically unique, as he produced his Apache flute and began playing a melody that seemed to capture the very essence of their struggle in musical form. The haunting notes echoed off the canyon walls like the voices of ancestral spirits, creating an atmosphere of sacred space that made the federal agents' mission feel like desecration rather than law enforcement. Several of the men found themselves unconsciously removing their hats as if they had entered a church. Agent Blackwood's response revealed the fundamental miscalculation that federal bureaucrats had made in dealing with this situation. "Boys," he said in the patronizing tone that adults often used with children they considered misguided, "you don't understand the gravity of your circumstances. Mrs. Ravensky has filled your heads with romantic notions about Indian life. But the reality is that you need proper education, Christian guidance, and preparation for useful citizenship in civilized society." His words demonstrated complete blindness to the spiritual transformation that had already occurred. Little Ben's reaction to this dismissal was swift and devastating in its simplicity. "Agent Blackwood," he said with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a confused adult, "you speak of civilization as if it were something that could only exist in buildings made of wood and stone, with people who all look the same and think the same thoughts. But we have learned that true civilization lives in the heart, and that love is the only law that really matters in the end." His response stripped away every justification the federal agents had brought with them. The confrontation escalated. When Blackwood ordered his men to begin physically removing the children from the canyon, a decision that triggered consequences no one had anticipated. As the agents moved toward the boys, the natural acoustics of the canyon began amplifying Samuel's flute music until it seemed to emanate from the rocks themselves, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the federal agents hesitate, as if they were advancing against supernatural forces. Simultaneously, Little Ben's spiritual gifts manifested in ways that challenged every assumption about the natural world that the agents had brought with them. The air around the child began to shimmer with an almost visible energy, and when he spoke, his words seemed to carry the accumulated wisdom of generations of Apache ancestors who had defended their sacred places against all who would desecrate them. "You come here with papers and badges and guns," Ben said, his 7-year-old voice somehow filling the entire canyon with its resonance. "But you do not understand that this place is protected by forces older and stronger than any government. The spirits of the land have accepted us as their children, and they will not permit us to be taken by those who serve only the cold laws of men who have forgotten how to listen to the voice of the Creator." His words were prophecy and warning combined. The federal agents found themselves in a situation for which their training had not prepared them, faced with resistance that transcended the purely physical realm and entered territory where their authority held no meaning. Several of the men began muttering prayers under their breath, while others cast nervous glances at the canyon walls as if expecting supernatural intervention at any moment. Agent Blackwood's attempt to restore control through force backfired spectacularly when he ordered his men to seize Little Ben by physical force. The moment an agent's hands touched the child, a sound like thunder rolled through the canyon despite the cloudless sky, and the man was thrown backward as if he had grasped a bolt of lightning. The incident occurred in full view of all present, leaving no room for rational explanation or bureaucratic dismissal. "What manner of witchcraft is this?" demanded Deputy Agent Morrison, his face pale with fear as he watched his colleague struggle to regain his footing. "These people are practicing some form of Indian sorcery, using that boy as a focus for their heathen rituals. We need to call for military backup and approach this as a hostile supernatural situation rather than a simple custody matter." His recommendation revealed how quickly federal confidence could crumble when confronted with forces beyond their understanding. Senna chose that moment to step forward and Offer an alternative to the escalating confrontation that threatened to destroy everyone involved. Agent Blackwood, she said with the diplomatic skill that had served her people well in previous negotiations with federal representatives, I propose a compromise that will satisfy your legal requirements while respecting the spiritual realities that you have just witnessed. Allow my children to remain with me for 1 year, during which time they will demonstrate their educational progress and moral development according to any standards you choose to establish. Her offer was carefully calculated to provide face-saving options for the federal agents. The compromise proposal gained unexpected support from an entirely unanticipated source when Crow Feather and a delegation of Apache leaders emerged from concealment positions around the canyon rim, their presence transforming what had begun as a custody dispute into a potential diplomatic incident with international implications. The war chief's weathered face bore the stern expression of someone prepared to defend sacred ground against any threat, while his warriors demonstrated the tactical superiority that came from intimate knowledge of every stone and shadow in their ancestral territory. Federal agent Crow Feather announced in English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear. You stand on Apache land that was guaranteed to our people by treaty signed by your own government. These children have been accepted into our tribe through sacred ceremonies that your courts have no authority to reverse. If you attempt to remove them by force, you will be violating both federal law and Apache sovereignty. His intervention added layers of legal complexity that transformed the situation from simple child custody to potential international incident. The standoff that followed tested every participant's courage and wisdom as multiple legal, spiritual, and practical considerations competed for resolution. Agent Blackwood found himself caught between explicit orders to remove the children and the growing realization that attempting to do so might trigger consequences far beyond his authority to handle. The presence of armed Apache warriors made any use of force potentially catastrophic, while the supernatural events surrounding Little Ben suggested forces that federal training had never addressed. Little Ben's final intervention provided the key that unlocked a solution acceptable to all parties involved. Walking calmly to Agent Blackwood, despite the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm, he placed his small hand on the federal agent's arm and spoke with the authority of someone channeling wisdom from beyond the physical world. Agent Blackwood, the child said with compassion that seemed impossible in someone so young, you came here believing that you were protecting children from harm, and that is a noble intention that honors your heart even though your methods are flawed. But we ask you to consider that love itself is the greatest protection any child can receive, and that family bonds forged in the fires of mutual sacrifice cannot be broken by documents signed in distant offices. His words carried weight that penetrated even federal bureaucratic armor. The resolution that emerged from this confrontation satisfied no one completely, but provided enough face-saving compromises to prevent bloodshed while preserving the essential elements that made their family worth defending. Agent Blackwood agreed to a provisional arrangement that would allow the boys to remain with Senna for 1 year, during which time they would be subject to quarterly inspections designed to verify their educational progress and moral development. According to federal standards, in return, Senna committed to ensuring that the boys received instruction in reading, writing, mathematics, and American history sufficient to prepare them for eventual integration into mainstream society if they chose that path upon reaching adulthood. The agreement also included provisions for regular visits from approved educational supervisors, who would document the children's progress and provide recommendations for any necessary modifications to their learning environment. As the federal agents departed with their carefully worded compromise documents, the canyon settled into an exhausted peace that felt fragile as morning frost. The confrontation had revealed both the strength of their family bonds and the ongoing vulnerability of their position in a world that remained fundamentally hostile to arrangements that challenged established racial and cultural boundaries. That evening, as they sat around their fire processing the day's events, each member of their unusual family understood that they had won a battle, but not the war. The federal government's reluctant acceptance of their arrangement came with conditions and oversight that would make their lives more complicated, but it also provided a measure of legal protection that had not existed before. The grandmother says this was a necessary trial. Little Ben reported with the matter-of-fact tone that had become familiar to all of them, one that had to be faced and overcome before we could move to the next stage of our purpose in this world. She says that sometimes you have to fight, not to win completely, but to force your enemies to recognize that defeating you would cost more than they are willing to pay. His spiritual wisdom provided context for understanding their partial victory. Tobias's response demonstrated the maturity that had been developing throughout their trials together. "We proved something important today," he observed with the analytical mind that made him a natural leader. "We showed them that we're not just random people who happen to find each other, but a real family with real power that comes from truly caring about each other. That's something they can't legislate away or bureaucracy out of existence." His insight captured the essential truth of their victory. Samuel's contribution came in the form of a new melody that seemed to weave together all the emotions and experiences of their confrontation with federal authority, transforming conflict into music that celebrated both struggle and survival. As his flute notes echoed through the canyon, they carried the promise that their story was far from over and that greater adventures lay ahead for a family that had proven love could indeed conquer seemingly impossible obstacles. 6 months after the federal confrontation that had nearly torn their family apart, an event occurred that would transform their precarious victory into something approaching triumph when the quarterly inspection arrived not in the form of suspicious bureaucrats, but as a carefully orchestrated delegation led by someone whose presence changed everything. Professor Margaret Whitman stepped down from her modest carriage with the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades challenging established academic thinking about race, culture, and the true meaning of civilization. In the American frontier, the renowned ethnologist from Harvard University had traveled over 2,000 miles after receiving reports about an Apache woman successfully raising white children using traditional indigenous methods combined with conventional frontier education. Her arrival represented a shift from hostile government oversight to scholarly investigation that promised to document their family's achievements rather than search for reasons to destroy them. Behind her walked 2 assistants carrying cameras, notebooks, and scientific instruments designed to record rather than condemn. "Mrs. Ravensky," Professor Whitman announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose academic credentials had opened doors throughout the intellectual establishment. "I am here not as an agent of federal bureaucracy, but as a scientist seeking to understand and document what appears to be a remarkable example of successful cross-cultural child rearing. Your reputation has reached academic circles that view your achievements as potentially revolutionary for understanding human adaptability and family formation." Her words carried implications that extended far beyond their immediate situation. Senna received this unexpected visitor with the formal courtesy that Apache culture demanded while privately marveling at the strange turns their story continued to take. 6 months earlier, federal agents had attempted to destroy their family through force and legal intimidation. Yet now representatives of the white intellectual establishment sought to study and potentially celebrate what they had accomplished. The irony was not lost on someone who had spent years navigating the contradictions of frontier racial politics. Little Ben emerged from the wickiup where he had been practicing traditional Apache prayers alongside Christian hymns that Senna fought to satisfy federal educational requirements. His appearance had changed dramatically during the months since their confrontation with Agent Blackwood, his small frame filling out with proper nutrition while his blue eyes retained the otherworldly depth that marked him as someone touched by supernatural forces. His immediate reaction to Professor Whitman demonstrated the spiritual discernment that continued to guide their family through complex situations. The kind professor brings different medicine than the agents who came before, Ben observed in his matter-of-fact tone, his young voice carrying wisdom that consistently amazed adults who encountered him. She seeks understanding rather than control, knowledge rather than power. The grandmother who guides my dreams says that this woman represents the beginning of changes that will spread far beyond our canyon home. His assessment proved remarkably accurate in ways that would become clear over the following weeks. Professor Whitman's methodology differed radically from previous official investigations, as she approached their family situation with the systematic curiosity of someone trained to observe without predetermined conclusions. Instead of looking for violations of federal regulations or evidence of cultural contamination, she documented the boys' remarkable educational progress, their sophisticated understanding of multiple cultural traditions, and their obvious emotional stability in ways that transformed potential criticism into academic celebration. Tobias, the professor said during one of her detailed interviews, your mathematical abilities exceed those of most children your age who have received conventional schooling, while your knowledge of natural science appears remarkably advanced for someone learning in non-traditional educational environments. Can you explain how Mrs. Ravensky has managed to provide such comprehensive instruction while also maintaining your cultural adaptability? Her question revealed genuine intellectual curiosity rather than bureaucratic skepticism. The 13-year-old boy had grown considerably during their months of stability, his natural intelligence flowering under Senna's patient instruction combined with traditional Apache teaching methods that emphasized learning through direct experience rather than rote memorization. Senna teaches us that everything in the world is connected, he replied with the confidence of someone whose education had been both practical and philosophical. So when we learn about plants, we also learn mathematics by calculating growing seasons and harvest yields. When we study animals, we learn geography by understanding migration patterns and habitat requirements. His response demonstrated educational sophistication that challenged conventional assumptions about frontier learning. Samuel's artistic development had progressed in directions that amazed even Professor Whitman, whose extensive travels had exposed her to various cultural approaches to creative expression. The 14-year-old's musical compositions now incorporated both traditional Apache melodies and European harmonic structures, creating hybrid works that represented something entirely new in American frontier culture. His ability to translate emotional experiences into musical language had attracted attention from musicians in distant territories who sought to understand his innovative techniques. This young man's musical development represents a remarkable synthesis of diverse cultural traditions. Professor Whitman wrote in her daily journal, which would later become part of her groundbreaking academic paper on cross-cultural education. His compositions demonstrate that artistic creativity can flourish when children are exposed to multiple cultural perspectives, rather than restricted to single traditional approaches. The emotional depth and technical sophistication of his work rivals that of formally trained musicians with years of conservatory education. Her assessment would prove influential in academic circles that shaped educational policy. The professor's most significant discovery concerned little Ben's extraordinary spiritual development, which had continued to manifest in ways that challenged conventional understanding of childhood psychological development. During her 2-week observation period, she documented numerous instances of the boy demonstrating knowledge that seemed to come from sources beyond normal sensory experience, including accurate predictions about weather patterns, animal behavior, and even the emotional states of people he had never met. This child exhibits what my European colleagues would classify as exceptional intuitive intelligence, Professor Whitman confided to Senna during one of their evening conversations. Beside the canyon fire, His ability to perceive underlying patterns and connections suggests cognitive development that transcends conventional educational categories. Academic institutions would benefit greatly from studying his learning methods and the environmental factors that have contributed to his remarkable abilities. Her scientific interest was genuine rather than exploitative. The transformation in their family's legal status began when Professor Whitman's preliminary reports reached influential academic and political circles that had the power to challenge federal bureaucratic decisions. Her documentation of the boy's exceptional educational progress, combined with her academic credentials and institutional connections, provided ammunition for supporters who argued that their unconventional family arrangement represented innovation rather than violation of established social norms. Agent Blackwood's surprise return to the canyon came not with enforcement orders, but with an official federal apology and revised documentation that recognized Senna's guardianship as a legitimate educational experiment worthy of government support rather than intervention. The transformation in his attitude reflected broader policy shifts that Professor Whitman's influence had helped generate within Federal Indian Affairs Administration. Mrs. Ravensky, the federal agent announced with considerably more respect than he had shown during his previous visit, "I have been instructed to inform you that your educational methods and family arrangement have been recognized as a successful model for cross-cultural child development. The federal government wishes to offer official support for your continued guardianship, including financial assistance for educational materials and periodic consultation opportunities with academic institutions interested in studying your innovative approaches." His words represented complete reversal of previous federal hostility. The boys' reaction to this unexpected victory demonstrated the maturity and wisdom they had developed through their trials together. Rather than celebrating their triumph over federal authority, they focused on understanding the responsibilities that came with their new status as subjects of academic study and potential models for other families facing similar challenges. We have to remember that our real victory isn't the government papers or the professor's approval. Tobias observed with the philosophical perspective that had been developing throughout their shared experiences. Our real victory is that we found each other and built something that helps us all become better people than we were before. Everything else is just the world catching up to what we already knew in our hearts. His insight captured the essential truth of their journey. Samuel's contribution to their processing of these developments came through a new musical composition that he titled Songs of Recognition, a complex piece that wove together themes representing their struggles, their growth, and their hopes for the future. The melody incorporated elements from both Apache traditional music and European classical structures, creating something that belonged fully to neither culture while honoring both. Little Ben's final assessment of their transformed situation demonstrated the spiritual wisdom that had guided them through their darkest moments and would continue to illuminate their path forward. "The grandmother says that our story is really just beginning," he reported with the calm certainty that had become his trademark, "and that what we've learned about love crossing boundaries will help other families find their way to each other. She says that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that show other people what's possible when they stop being afraid of differences and start celebrating the ways that love can bring healing to a broken world." His words carried the weight of prophecy and the promise of continuing adventures. As autumn settled over their canyon home with golden light that transformed the red sandstone walls into natural cathedrals, the family that had begun with a desperate auction purchase had evolved into something unprecedented in frontier history. They had proven that love could indeed transcend racial boundaries, that education could flourish outside conventional institutions, and that families formed by choice could be stronger than those determined by blood alone. Their victory was complete, not because they had defeated their enemies, but because they had transformed opposition into understanding and fear into celebration of human possibility. 25 years after a widowed Apache woman had shocked A frontier auction by purchasing 3 orphaned boys with burlap sacks over their heads. The red sandstone canyon that had sheltered their unlikely family had become something extraordinary in the annals of American frontier history. The Ravensky Institute for Cross-Cultural Education now occupied expanded facilities carved into the living rock of the canyon walls, where children from dozens of different backgrounds came to learn that love could indeed transcend any boundary that human prejudice might attempt to construct. What had begun as one woman's desperate act of compassion had evolved into a movement that challenged fundamental assumptions about race, family, and the true meaning of civilization in the American West. Tobias Ravensky, now 37 years old and bearing the surname he had chosen to honor the woman who had given him life, stood before the assembled delegates of the Territorial Education Conference as the Institute's Director of Academic Programs. His weathered hands held the same steady authority that had once helped him survive as an orphan child, but now they guided educational innovations that were being studied and replicated throughout the Western Territories. Behind him, carved into the canyon wall in both English and Apache script, were the words that had become the Institute's motto: "Family begins with choice, not chance." Distinguished colleagues, Tobias addressed the gathering of educators, government officials, and tribal leaders who had traveled from across the continent to study their methods. When people ask how our institute has achieved such remarkable success in preparing young people for productive citizenship while maintaining respect for cultural diversity, I tell them about a 7-year-old boy who once knew my adoptive mother's Apache name before she had ever spoken it aloud. That child, now Dr. Benjamin Ravensky, has become one of the territory's most respected physicians and spiritual counselors, demonstrating that some forms of knowledge transcend the boundaries that divide so-called civilized society from so-called savage traditions. His words carried the weight of personal testimony, backed by decades of proven results. Dr. Benjamin Ravensky emerged from the Institute's medical clinic, where he had been treating a young Navajo girl whose family had brought her hundreds of miles seeking help for seizures that conventional medicine had failed to address. At 32, little Ben had retained the piercing blue eyes and spiritual sensitivity that had first marked him as extraordinary. But years of formal medical education, combined with traditional Apache healing practices, had transformed his childhood gifts into practical abilities that saved lives on a regular basis. His innovative synthesis of scientific medicine with indigenous healing wisdom had attracted students from major universities who sought to understand his unprecedented success rates. The child I was treating today reminds me of myself at her age, Dr. Ravensky told the assembled delegates, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone that had characterized his childhood observations. She hears voices that speak to her in languages that exist beyond the physical world, and her family fears that she is cursed or mentally deficient. But I have learned that such children are often blessed with forms of perception that our educational systems fail to recognize or develop properly. Here at the Institute, we have created learning environments that honor both scientific rigor and spiritual sensitivity, producing graduates who can function effectively in conventional society while maintaining connection to deeper sources of wisdom. His explanation challenged fundamental assumptions about mental health and educational methodology. Samuel Ravensky's contribution to the gathering came in the form of a musical performance that demonstrated the artistic achievements possible when children were encouraged to synthesize multiple cultural traditions rather than forced to choose between them. Now 34 and recognized as one of the territory's most innovative composers, he had created a body of work that incorporated Apache ceremonial music, European classical structures, African rhythmic patterns learned from freed slaves who had joined their community, and Mexican folk melodies absorbed from vaqueros who worked the surrounding ranches. His latest composition, Songs of the Many-Colored Canyon, was being performed by orchestras in Eastern, cities where cultural critics hailed it as representing a uniquely American artistic voice. The afternoon session of the conference focused on the Institute's most controversial and successful program, the integration of children from families engaged in active conflict with each other. Apache children whose fathers had been killed by cavalry soldiers learned alongside the children of cavalry officers whose parents had died in Apache raids, while former slaves studied mathematics with the children of Confederate veterans who had fled west after the Civil War. The psychological and social innovations required to make such arrangements work had attracted attention from European researchers studying conflict resolution and social healing. The key to our success, explained Dr. Maria Santos Ravensky, a former captive Mexican child who had been rescued from Comanche raiders and had eventually become the Institute's Director of Psychological Services, lies in our understanding that hatred is a learned behavior that can be unlearned through carefully structured experiences of mutual dependency and shared achievement. When children from conflicting backgrounds are required to work together on challenging projects that demand the unique strengths each cultural tradition provides, they discover that their differences are sources of power rather than reasons for conflict. Her methodology had been documented in academic papers that influenced government policy regarding post-conflict reconstruction. The evening's presentation featured the Institute's most remarkable achievement, the first graduating class of students who had completed the full 12-year program that Senator Ravensky had developed during the Institute's early years. These young adults, now ranging in age from 18 to 22, represented every major cultural group present in the Southwestern Territories, yet they functioned as a cohesive community that transcended traditional tribal, racial, and national boundaries while maintaining respect for the distinctive traditions that had shaped their individual identities. Standing before the delegates was an Apache young woman who spoke fluent Spanish, English, and 3 tribal languages while demonstrating mastery of both traditional healing practices and modern agricultural techniques. Beside her stood a former slave child who had become an expert in both African storytelling traditions and European mathematical principles, his innovations in engineering having already contributed to major irrigation projects that were transforming desert regions into productive farmland. A Mexican boy who had been orphaned during border conflicts had grown into a skilled diplomat who specialized in negotiating peaceful resolutions to disputes between different cultural communities. "What you see before you," announced Sena Ravensky herself, now 57 years old and bearing the dignified bearing of someone who had lived to see her most ambitious dreams become reality, represents the fulfillment of a vision that began with 3 frightened orphan boys and 1 desperate widow who refused to accept that love must be limited by the color of skin or the accident of birth. These young people are living proof that human beings can transcend the artificial boundaries that politicians and generals use to justify conflict and division. Her words carried the authority of someone whose life had become a testament to the power of love applied with wisdom and courage. The conference's final day brought an unexpected development that would ensure the Institute's influence extended far beyond the Southwestern Territories when a delegation arrived from Washington, bearing official recognition from the federal government that had once tried to destroy their family. President Rutherford Hayes had signed legislation establishing the Ravensky Institute as a national model for cross-cultural education, providing federal funding for the establishment of similar institutions throughout the Western Territories. And beyond, Agent Marcus Blackwood, now promoted to Director of Federal Indian Education Programs, delivered the official proclamation with a humility that reflected his personal transformation during the years since his confrontational visit to their canyon home. "Mrs. Ravensky," he said formally, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than bureaucratic authority, "it is my honor to inform you that the federal government now recognizes your educational methods as representing the most successful approach to preparing diverse populations for productive citizenship that has been documented in American history. Your institute's graduates demonstrate higher literacy rates, better conflict resolution skills, and more innovative problem-solving abilities than students from conventional educational institutions. His acknowledgement represented complete vindication of everything they had fought to preserve. Little Ben's spiritual gifts, which had once seemed like supernatural anomalies that threatened federal authority, were now being studied by government researchers seeking to understand intuitive intelligence and its potential applications in diplomacy, medicine, and conflict resolution. Dr. Benjamin Ravensky had been invited to establish similar programs at major universities, though he remained committed to maintaining his base in the canyon where his gifts had first been recognized and nurtured. The grandmother who guided my childhood dreams, Dr. Ravensky told the assembled delegates during the conference's closing ceremony, once told me that our family story would echo through generations yet unborn, creating ripples of healing that would spread far beyond anything we could imagine during our lifetimes. Today I understand what she meant, because each child who graduates from our institute carries these lessons into communities throughout the continent, where they will raise their own children with the understanding that love recognizes no boundaries, that human wisdom cannot transcend. His words carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled. The establishment of satellite institutes in California, Texas, Colorado, and Montana represented the practical expansion of principles that had been tested and refined in their original canyon laboratory. Each new facility adapted their core methodology to local cultural conditions while maintaining the fundamental commitment to proving that diversity strengthened rather than weakened human communities when properly understood and respectfully managed. Senna's personal reflection on the day's events, shared with her original 3 sons during their private family gathering that evening, revealed the deeper satisfaction that came from witnessing love applied with practical wisdom transform not only individual lives, but entire social systems. When I saw you 3 boys standing on that auction platform with sacks over your heads, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of years spent turning impossible dreams into documented reality, I heard the voices of my ancestors telling me that this moment would change everything for countless children who had not yet been born. Tonight I understand that their prophecy has been fulfilled in ways that exceed even my most ambitious hopes. Her words captured the profound satisfaction of a life lived in service to something greater than personal survival. Tobias had grown into a man whose leadership abilities had attracted attention from territorial governments, seeking innovative approaches to cultural integration and educational development. His marriage to Dr. Helena Martinez, a Spanish physician who had joined the Institute's medical staff, had produced 3 children who were growing up trilingual and bicultural, representing the next generation of Americans who would consider such diversity completely normal rather than remarkable. Samuel's artistic achievements had expanded beyond individual composition to include the establishment of the Pavlik Institute's Cultural Preservation Program, which documented traditional music, stories, and artistic techniques from dozens of different cultural traditions, while encouraging their synthesis into new forms of creative expression. His work had influenced the development of a uniquely American artistic movement that celebrated diversity while creating unity through shared aesthetic experiences. Dr. Benjamin's medical practice had evolved into a comprehensive healing center that attracted patients from across the continent seeking treatment that honored both physical symptoms and spiritual causes of illness. His innovations in combining scientific diagnosis with traditional healing practices had resulted in cure rates that conventional medicine struggled to explain, leading to his appointment as advisor to federal health programs serving indigenous populations. As the sun set behind the canyon walls that had sheltered their family through its most vulnerable years, 4 people who had found each other through the mysterious workings of love and destiny contemplated the legacy they had built together. Their story had begun with a desperate auction and a supernatural recognition. but it had evolved into something that would influence American society for generations to come. The final entry in Senna's personal journal, written that evening, by firelight as she had done every night for 25 years, captured the essential truth that had guided their remarkable journey. Love applied with wisdom and courage can indeed transform the world, one family at a time, one child at a time, one choice at a time. We began as strangers divided by race and culture and circumstance, but we have become proof that the human spirit recognizes no boundaries that cannot be transcended by those brave enough to try. May our story encourage others to take the same leap of faith that brought us together, and may the love we have shared continue to ripple outward until all of God's children understand that they belong to the same family. Her words would be discovered years later by historians studying the transformation of American society, serving as testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when guided by extraordinary love. The stars that emerged above their canyon that night shone down on an institute where children from dozens of different backgrounds slept peacefully under the same desert sky, their dreams filled with possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs, while the night wind carried the promise that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove that love remained the strongest force in a world still learning to celebrate its own magnificent diversity.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.